Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Itachi was interested in having a child. Petunia performs a bit of accidental magic. It says something about her parenting that Uchiha Itachi is considered a better prospect for raising a child. Young Hari is raised by one of the most infamous nukenin of all time and a cadre of uncles whose cumulative effect is very prominent. And someone had the bright idea to bring him back to England. Merlin helps them all. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 43, Transit to Insanity. Wherein the Hogwarts Express is apparently running local, and doesn't leave until the chapter nearly ends. Hermione was stalking the corridors looking for Harry when she bumped into Daphne. Like her yearmate, she was levitating her trunk, though without noticing she was doing it. "Have you seen him?" she demanded. "I assume you mean Harry?" Daphne's reply was distinctly cool. The two of them stood to the side as a trio of first years were chased down the hall by a blonde in a mask, cackling gleefully. Daphne grabbed her sister's shoulder. "Where's Harry?" "Compartment right at the front." The masked girl twitched her fingers, sending one young student sprawling. "Aren't the prefects entitled to those?" asked Hermione as she watched the blonde tackle the boy her age and proceed to tickle him, while he begged for mercy and wet himself. "And you think Harry will let that bother him?" Astoria had climbed off the lad and pulled a giant, inflated mallet from somewhere before giving chase after the other two. "Don't you think the prefects might?" "It's possible." Daphne began to walk towards the front of the train. What the two of them found was a trio of upper years with a conspicuous lack of wands, but the expressions that said they were authority figures dealing with Harry Potter. Under normal circumstances, the three would have had their wands out and been attempting to use spells, but there was a wariness that all of Harry's students had when contemplating the idea of attempting anything that might be considered aggressive, a caution only enhanced by the events of the summer and their former peers' responses to even the suggestion of violence. "Come on," one girl with a badge was saying. "This is supposed to be a prefect compartment. Please go somewhere else." "No thanks," came the voice from inside. "I'm comfortable, thank you." "She didn't ask if you're comfortable," hissed a boy who was wearing the trim of a seventh-year prefect on his robes. "She asked if you would please move elsewhere." "Please? What do you think?" A pause. "Nah, I didn't think so." "Sorry, I'm good." "Urian Farnsworthy," said the last of the prefects. "Let's just kick some first ties out of a compartment and enlarge it. We'll be less frustrated in the end." "Fine. Fine." The boy sighed. He tromped off, scowling. He was followed by the two girls who shook their heads in frustrated sympathy. Daphne and Hermione stepped into the compartment and stopped dead. Dead. Inside was something very different from the usual collection of benches and overhead racks. Instead, there were a half-dozen overstuffed chairs, a quartet of divans, cabinets with crystal fronts that revealed a selection of snacks, a suit of armor holding some kind of object with far too many sharp edges and spikes, and even dozen windows, only some of which looked out on the platform, the others looked out at what Hermione recognized as the Globe Theatre, the Royal Opera House, Wimbledon, and what she was fairly sure was Parliament during a session 100 years ago, and a roaring fire. Harry was sprawled on a divan in front of the fire with a slim notebook in his hand, a pile of notebooks with what looked like excessively complex magical locks stacked up beside him, and a giant if lean black dog on a leash. The dog was industriously chewing on the lead with no sign of enjoyment and every appearance of a being hard at work at an important task. "This is the prefect cabin?" hissed Daphne. "No." Harry turned a page and scribbled line after line of incomprehensible symbols. "Hi Hermione, Daphne. How are you?" The two looked at each other. "Me first," they both said. "Uh-huh." Harry continued to write. "Me." Harry turned a page. He casually pulled a penny out of his pocket and flicked it at the two girls. Hermione is heads. The two looked at the coin as it landed. Daphne it is. You got my parents arrested. So. He almost got me arrested. Daphne ignored her friend. Harry, you got my parents arrested. You got Pansy's dad's arm cut off. If I recall, your parents were arrested for being friends with people trying to kill Aurors. Harry paused. No, I tell a lie, who killed Aurors? Oh, and not just being friends, but actually being at the party where the murders in question took place. Daphne stared at him. In 2 years, she'd never heard him be so coldly blunt before. I'm still fairly certain you caused it. And you definitely cut off Pansy's dad's arm. I think that was Goyle's dad attacking the Aurors and screaming for everyone to attack in the name of some dark lord. Also, that was my former student who dismembered Mr. Pansy's dad, and I had to make him go back and do the job properly. Daphne goggled at him. What's bothering you, Hermione? You almost got me arrested for violating the statute of secrecy. Harry closed his eye for a moment. No. I don't remember doing that. I levitated my dad after you kicked him in the face. And Muggles saw. Sounds like a violation, all right. Hermione? What? Snapped the girl, glaring at Daphne. Why aren't you under arrest? Why did you think it was a good idea to levitate your father in the middle of a crowded beach? Asked the Obliviator. I'll need to see your wand, by the way. I'd wanted to show my mom magic and I needed to get my dad inside and, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. In front of Muggles? I forgot, okay? And your wand? The man sounded bored. I don't have it. Look, girl, telling me you don't have your wand won't do a bit of good. I don't have it. I haven't had it for 1.5 years. Not since HarryPotter took it from me. Why does Professor Potter have your wand? Asked a young man wearing the robes of a trainee Obliviator. Wait. You're Granger, right? You're one of his friends. The man who'd been questioning Hermione went pale. One moment, please. There were some hurried words between the trainer and trainee. Hermione didn't catch most of them, but she made out Diagon and Pants shitting fear. The Obliviator walked back over. Let's call this a horrible case of accidental magic. We'll take care of the cover-up. Please don't do this again and please don't tell Professor Potter that we made trouble for you. I'm not really sure, said Hermione. It was weird. I get the feeling it's Harry's fault somehow. Isn't everything? Muttered Daphne. According to Professor Snape. And what isn't, he blames me for anyway. Harry's tone was cheerful. 15 minutes later, Blaise walked into the room. Dear Merlin. He turned to Harry. Never tell my mother about this. I don't want to hear about her trying to seduce Dumbledore so she can inherit this. Nah. He's gay. I'm not going to ask how you know, said Daphne. Seconded. Speaking of that, growled Blaise. You know my mom keeps dropping broad hints about how if our relationship continues, we should ask one of our friends to surrogate for us. What relationship? Asked Daphne. Harry's not going to be near my genetics, thank you very much, said Hermione at the same time. My mother thinks that I snuck Harry over to our villa while she was checking on her fiancé. She didn't just hint, really, she outright said it a few times. And she bought me guides. And other things. I saw her reading So Your Wizard Likes Wands. Dear gods, muttered Daphne, covering her face. Why was your mom reading that? Asked Tracy as she walked into the room. Blaise's mom caught him having Harry over while she was out. Oh. Tracy blinked. My mother is going to be so disappointed to hear that Harry is off the market. I'm not gay. Screamed Blaise. And I am most definitely not fucking Harry Potter. In the echoes, there was a sound of curiosity from the dog. Great. Even the dog thinks I'm gay. Nah. Harry hadn't looked up from his notebook. I know you're not having sex with me. Yeah. My mom is just doing it to mess with me. But it doesn't make it any less infuriating. Your mom teases you about your non-existent love life too? Asked Tracy from her seat next to Daphne. I thought it was just mine. No. My mom has been implying that Harry and I are having an affair since she first met him. You people have weird parents, said Hermione. She had pulled out the big book of runes you don't need to know, and had opened to her bookmark near the back of the tome nearly as tall as she was. Speaking of my mother, said Tracy. My mom asked that I pass a few messages. The first was just her making a noise I normally think of coming from teenage witches who are about to see Stubby Boardman in concert. She also said how cool it is to know someone who's now an active member of Soldier of Fortune. Then she asked me to pass alone a message from Lazo, that's her arms dealer. Well, he was until you. Now he just gets her ammo, who said that you're an okay guy and you did good by the guys who he passed your info to. Also, he gave her a message to give you from them. They said something about nice work in the Congo or something, that no one's been making trouble since your intervention, and that they'll be letting their friends know that there's an outfit that gets the job done. That's awesome. Harry stopped writing to grin hugely. Dad never founded his own mercenary organization. Harry. Hermione started to speak and then stopped. She looked at Tracy. If I ask for clarification, will I regret it? Maybe? You might have some insight into a news story in the paper. Which one? You sure you want to know? Not really. Blaze had opened up a copy of the Daily Prophet and was buried in the crossword, which was three-dimensional and mocked wrong answers. The headline read Lockhart robs London bank, steals 30,000 in gold bullion. The article went on to detail how Lockhart had led a gang of brazen thieves who had charmed the owner of a pawn shop into thinking he had a day job copying the dictionary in a small office while they tunneled into the bank using shovels and other muggle tools. Millicent walked in a while later, wearing new robes and grinning broadly. I made a fortune. Thanks, Harry. I will regret this, said Daphne. Why are you thanking him? The prison guards paid me lots of money to hit prisoners who were making trouble. Millicent fairly glowed. All because I slugged an oar during that incident in Diagon Alley. Wait. Blaze looked up from where he'd perched on the arm of Hermione's chair, and been trying to read over her shoulder with obvious lack of understanding. Were you in prison? No. Oh good. I was in jail, silly. That's such a difference. Actually, it is. Hermione had curtailed her reading to interject in a place where minutiae was relevant. Jails are for people who are awaiting trial. She paused. Or execution. Prisons are where people serve sentences. Azkaban, for example, is a prison. Exactly. Millie was still beaming. I got to break up riots and stuff. Mum was so proud and so jealous that I got paid to do what she always did for free. Though she usually started the riot first. Maybe that's why they didn't pay her? That actually sounds like a really good reason not to pay someone. Tracy seemed mildly amused. I'm sorry, said Blaze. You didn't reply to my letters because you were in jail? Yeah. Why didn't you reply when you got out? I was only released this morning. Mum paid them to lose the arrest record. Bribery? Demanded Hermione, in abject horror. Well, yeah. That's not right. It's not. Blaze sounded confused. But that's how the system works, right? Besides, said Harry, suddenly. Are you saying you want Millie to still be in jail? What? No. But you shouldn't be able to just openly bribe the guards. She didn't do that. She made a donation to Fudge's re-election campaign. And the warden was really nice. He had a couple of the guards escort me to the platform, and even had a guard make sure to get the stuff I needed from Diagon. Blaise was patting Hermione's head. Don't worry so much about it. But it's not right. So, you do want Millie to be in jail? No. Well, make up your mind. Blaise grinned. Or just go back to your book. Hermione subsided into grumbles as she returned to her reading. A moment later, she used magic to shove him off the arm of the chair. Nice balance, she commented as she turned a page. We'll work on that along with your magic, said Harry. We'll what? You won't be needing this. Harry was examining a wand. Nice and clean. He snapped it in half. I have too many of these lying around already. Blaise? Yes, Tracy? Blaise growled, staring at the two halves of his wand as Harry set them on fire. I'm totally writing to your mom to tell her Harry snapped your wand. If you do, I will kill you. Don't you mean natural causes? Asked Daphne. No. It was worthless anyway, added Harry. I mean, it's just a stick. Maybe I should tell her that Harry had very deft hands when he grabbed your wand? Seriously. I'll kill you. There was a sound from the dog before it went back to gnawing. You really don't need it. I'll make sure of that. Harry went back to make notes. You burned my wand. I burned a piece of wood. Now stop complaining. You don't hear Daphne or Hermione upset. Any more, growled Daphne. She watched as Harry somehow dodged the stinging hex she wandlessly shot at him, and continued his work without seeming to notice. I could tell her Harry made you scream in front of a group of girls. Kill. You. Lay off him, Tracy. Hermione didn't look up from her own text. Blaise needs as much peace as he can get. This year is going to be hard enough without you teasing him. Who's teasing? Tracy. Fine. Fine. Do I get a say in this? Asked Blaise. No, replied Hermione, Daphne, and Harry. I had to go through hell, you can suffer it too, snapped Hermione. Agreed. Don't you whine or we'll beat you and then drag you downstairs to Harry. Isn't it nice that I didn't even have to threaten you? Asked Harry. Blaise just glowered. 15 minutes after that, a harried-looking pansy entered the compartment, with a slightly vacant look on her face. What happened to you? Asked Tracy. My father is not in the best of spirits. Losing his wand and his arm have not exactly endeared Harry to him. It's just good he's been on so many painkillers, otherwise he'd be much more unpleasant. She rubbed her face. And she paused. Never mind. She lay back on a divan and closed her eyes. The dog whined for a moment, then trotted over and licked her hand. She opened one eye and patted it. Then things registered. Harry? What's that? What's what? Asked Harry, setting aside his notebook and taking out a pad onto which he began to sketch some symbols. This dog. Oh. So, you know what it is then, and I don't need to tell you. Hermione happened to glance up and began to stare at Harry's drawings. Harry? Yes, Daphne? Why do you have a dog? I found him. She sighed. Where did you find him? The platform. Harry, did you steal someone's pet? Asked Tracy. No. He's a mongrel stray. I'm going to keep him. There was a strange sound from the dog. His name is Sprinkles. The sound this time was rather strangled. Then the dog went back to licking Pansy's fingers. Why is your dog licking me? No idea. Is it annoying you? A little. Okay. Harry yanked on the leash and the dog gave a choked yelp as it was pulled across the compartment. Hello, Tam, said Harry as he went back to his drawing. The door slid open. How did you know they've upgraded it? I'll take your word for it. Harry? Said Tracy. Why is Ginny Weasley here? And why is she wearing a red and silver tie? You didn't tell them? Demanded Tam. Tell them what? Tell us what? You really didn't tell them? Tell them what? Tell us what? Tam opened her mouth for a moment and then paused, apparently reconsidering. I'm Tam Riddle. I was Ginny Weasley until Ginny did something very stupid to her soul. I am the result. My name is Tam. Unless you talk to anyone official, then it's still Ginny. Is that why your eyes are glowing red and you aren't acting like Ginny? Asked Blaze. Tam paused again. Yes. Yes, it is. Everyone looked at Hermione. Don't look at me. I don't know anything about soul magic. That's seriously dark stuff and I'm not allowed in the restricted section. There's nothing in there anyway, said Harry. Though I'm not sure why you let a minor detail like that stop you. I thought we'd dealt with that. If you're the result of dark magic, aren't you a dark creature? Or, at least, evil? Said Millie. Definitely not, and not really. Just impatient. Speaking of that, do you want to learn wandless magic with Blaze? Asked Harry. I already know wandless magic. You do? Hermione sounded more annoyed than surprised. I guess you don't need this. Harry held up Ginny's, now Tam's, wand and then set it on fire. You. Kind teacher who will instruct you in wandless magic. Very good, Tam. Harry finished her sentence and went back to drawing. Tracy grinned hugely. Blaze, should I tell your mum that you're jealous that Harry is handling someone else's wand? Or that you're okay with that? Tracy. Snapped Hermione just before Blaze tried to jump over and strangle the redhead, who accidentally dodged as she fell onto the floor, clutching her stomach. I realize that this seems a bit out of nowhere, said Pansy, still lying on the divan. But why do your house colors appear to be red and silver? I'm in a bit of Gryffindor and a bit of Slytherin. Professor Dumbledore said that I was very Gryffindor for reasons. But that I could be in Slytherin if I wanted. I chose the option that keeps me away from this. Tam reached outside the compartment and dragged in a girl Toby, who looked sheepish in as much as could be seen with a mask on. I found this thing having cornered a few first years and was tickling them until they gave her their pocket change. Daphne covered her face in her hands. Harry? Said Tam. Please tell me you aren't planning to charge that rune set. Or that you'll warn me so I can be elsewhere. Why? Asked Hermione. Because I'm fairly certain that it would conjure chlorine gas. Oh. The train was nearing Hogsmeade when Harry put away his sketch pad and leaned back. That's interesting. Oh no. Tam cocked her head. Why do you say that, Parkinson? Whenever Harry finds something interesting, some sort of monster is abroad. Tam gave a weak, forced laugh. You don't say. The room started to get cold. Breath began to smoke. Oh. Oh shit. Tam was glaring at Harry. I could really use my wand right now. She went over to the cabinets and tore one open. Chocolate frogs were hurled over her shoulders at people. We'll need these. A pause. Assuming we're around to need it. Pansy curled up and began to sob quietly. Soon after, most of the others were in similarly unhappy states. Millicent seemed mostly confused, Tam was just gritting her teeth, and Sprinkles was curled up around Pansy's arm and whining. Harry just seemed intrigued. You do know they'll eat our souls, right? Hissed Tam. She paused. They'll try to eat our souls anyway. Yeah. Harry frowned and looked at his friends. They're also why everyone's like that, right? Yes. Tam's eyes were more like glowing embers than their earlier gleam. It's not fun. The compartment door slid open. Well, fuck that then. Something bright flashed across the open space between Harry and the door, and then there was a thunk and a blood-curdling scream of pain and confused rage. There was a sensation of dozens of shapes flooding off the train, and then the cold receded even as the shrieking continued. Tam's eyes began to return to their usual brightness. She stared at where the cloaked form was clawing desperately at something embedded in the middle of its hooded head that apparently had pinned it to the wall. Dear gods! I never stood a chance, did I? Harry was shaking people's shoulders and pushing chocolate frogs into their hands. Oh. Nah. I would like to reiterate my thanks you chose the option you did. Okay. Harry shook Pansy again. Come on. They're gone. He ignored the plaintive cries that had begun to dwindle into muted burbles of sorrow. Tam had pulled out a small knife with heavy leather wrapped around the hilt. She walked over to the trapped Dementor and began to prod its limbs, carefully considering the noises it made after each attempt. A man who looked like he had seen better centuries came running down the corridor and stopped dead. What the? He stared open-mouthed. We have chocolate, said Tam. She prodded the Dementor again and smiled as it made a tortured sound. The man stared some more. Then he ran by, giving the Dementor a large berth as he headed towards the front of the train. Outtake. Good afternoon, class. Harry was sitting in the chair at the professor's desk, feet propped up and leaning back. Today we have a guest instructor. He nodded at the dark-haired man standing in front of the room. His pale features were highlighted by thin scars running across his eyes. Said eyes had little swirling things in them, they looked rather like Harry's right eye. Good afternoon, said the man. My name is Uchiha Itachi. I'm going to go over special techniques for dealing with certain kinds of aggressors. Everyone get up, this is going to be a practical lesson. There was a shiver of fear in the students that Itachi found vaguely unsettling. Clear the desks. And now the terrified obedience as they hurried to move things out of the way. Right. Now, everyone enter the basic stance. After almost a minute of the students looking in pale horror at him, Itachi frowned. One student passed out in the back of the class. Huh. A moment's pause. Harry? He asked, not taking his eyes off the students. Yes, Dad? The collective anxiety became collective anxiety laced with confusion. You did teach them the basic stance. The what? Itachi covered his face with his hands and sighed. Hayden taught it to you. He probably called it pussy bitch stance or something. Oh. The limpdick loser cunt stance? He said I didn't need that. Of course not. Besides, the youngest class is, 11. They should know this stuff already. Has your time with them given you the impression that melee combat training features heavily in their youth education? Nothing said it didn't. I see. Me too, thanks, Dad. All right. Everyone outside. We're going to have some lessons. There were more flinches and looks of concern. Grass is softer than stone. You will be falling down a lot. Dumbledore stood at the head table and stared off into the distance. Finally he shook himself. I have the distinctly confusing pleasure of welcoming our most recent guest instructor to Hogwarts. Professor Uchiha. Today, I understand that only one student is in the hospital wing and Mr. Malfoy is there due to an unrelated incident involving a book and Miss Granger attempting to brain her friend with it. I recommend that she take up cricket during the summer, and that if she could manage to fly at all, she might consider Chaser on her house team. Slytherin could use the points. Back to my point though. Professor Uchiha taught some much-needed basic training and underlying learning that would probably have come in handy earlier this year. I am genuinely at a loss for words, since I had begun to think that no one associated with Professor Potter's home life was capable of interacting with others sans attempted murder or, at the least, significant bloodshed. Dumbledore turned to Itachi, who was covering his face with his hands again. Professor Snape had leaned over, and had been commiserating while also ascertaining that Uchiha Itachi was in no way related to. Chapter 44, The Confusion and Sorting It Out. Or when Lupin had concerns. Dumbledore stood at Hogsmeade Station with a frown on his face, well, hidden behind his beard. He was not thrilled about having to delay the opening feast in order to deal with what was almost certainly HarryPotter's latest escapade. He supposed he had been lucky so far in that so few of the boys' activities had ended up being his problem. That didn't make it any better, though. And there was the pitiful sound coming from the train, too. That wasn't nice at all. "Remus," he said. "Yes, Professor Dumbledore? You said that this is a Dementor making that noise?" "Yes." "A Dementor that is, in fact, trapped?" "Yes, sir. It seems that sometimes Severus is right, if only by accident. I feel it is safe to assume this is his fault." Dumbledore walked around the train and along the tracks, stopping when he saw the point of something poking through the metal wall of the train. "I could have sworn that this was enchanted to resist damage." He tapped the metal with his wand. "Expecto Patronum." An ethereal phoenix flew out of his wand and into the train through the wall. The sounds became screams of unearthly terror, and the point visible began to quiver. Was that necessary, Professor?" asked Lupin. "Strictly speaking, no. But I had to see what would happen." Dumbledore used his wand tip to push the point back into the train and watched as the Dementor rushed off into the night, pursued by a Patronus. "Well, that was fun. Let's go have dinner, HM?" Lupin was staring at his former headmaster and current employer with a look of concern. "Let's go, Remus." Remus Lupin's day had become very surreal very quickly. He'd been brought in by Professor Dumbledore because Sirius Black had escaped Azkaban, something he'd been unaware of until Professor Dumbledore had shown up on Lupin's doorstep and made the job offer. He was conflicted about not mentioning the whole Animagus thing, but reasoned that it wasn't like Professor Dumbledore didn't already know the man did tend to know everything in his castle. He'd spent a pleasant rest of the summer preparing for the school year, and stocking up on enough wine coolers, and he'd found that his transformation was easiest tipsy and stoned, and that his wolf side tended to be pretty mellow under those circumstances, and usually just, well, wolfed down a big bowl of dog food, and went to sleep, but that had not prepared him for the sights of the platform. Most of it had been the usual stuff, parents saying goodbye and so on. But then there had been two girls who just walked around with trunks floating behind them, and not from the fancy trunk maker in Diagon who made self-moving trunks. Then there had been the crazy child creature with the mask who'd run down the length of the platform with several random objects orbiting her and some of them launching themselves at other young people who she seemed to gleefully chase. There had also been the woman who was clearly dangerous. She was an incredibly pretty redhead with a very obvious diamond ring, not that he'd seen it at first, with the largest handgun he'd ever seen. She also hadn't had it holstered and continually looked like she was about to point it at someone and pull the trigger. There had been the girl who'd shown up with a look he had last seen on Black's face, along with a vile-looking mother and a man who was probably her father, but who looked like he'd seen better days, and also times when he might have had all his limbs. And that was to say nothing of spotting the kindly Weasley clan with their youngest, the only girl, who had glowing, red eyes and carried herself like a veteran of a war, although he'd seen her very quietly enchant a young man's shoelaces to tie themselves together at the right time to fall face first into a passing trunk. Oh, and there had been the rather ugly girl who'd shown up with an escort of the Ministry's finest and a sack of galleons. He'd searched for the last remaining link he had to the good times of his youth, well, discounting the traitorous son of a bitch who he was hoping to have a chance to transform on, without success. That had been depressing, but he'd figured the lad might have arrived early and searched the train. No luck there either. He'd finally settled into a fitful doze to pass the train ride. The next thing he remembered was waking up very cold. It had taken several moments to work out what was going on, and then conjure his Patronus and go to check the train. What he'd found was a distinctly small sample of Dementor activity. In fact, he'd found just the one pin to the wall, and being prodded by the youngest Weasley who'd casually dismissed him with a declaration of chocolate possession. Having just watched Professor Dumbledore torment a Dementor, he was somehow still unprepared for his discovery of a gigantic scroll in the entrance hall. It was a letter of dismissal signed by the Board of Governors. There was nothing to indicate that the order had been rescinded, but it was nevertheless in a place of clear prominence. And Dumbledore didn't seem inclined to stop long enough to explain. Life was not making sense anymore. Harry listened absently as the Sorting Hat chanted some drivel about something. It involved 4 dead people and various traits he'd been unsure if they had possessed, given whom he'd seen end up in their houses. He watched as the formulae on the hat whirled around as it was placed on each head, and idly scribbled them down for later. Now that he was going to have formal training, it would be good to have some things to study in his spare time again. "Why does everyone clap?" he asked Hermione, who had just enthusiastically applauded a young blonde waif who had sprinted over to the table of the snake and plopped down with the others her age. "How's solidarity?" Daphne shrugged, having decided that the conversation was more interesting than watching her sister poke Ron Weasley until he looked at her and immediately looking away. "What's that?" "Forget it." Harry ignored much of the rest of the sorting beyond making some more notes about the hat and who was sorted where. "Any idea who Sirius Black is?" There was a sharp sound from Sprinkles. "Why do you ask?" Pansy leaned forwards, her recent scowl softening slightly. "Who is he?" "A renowned mass murderer. He exploded a dozen muggles. My parents are big fans of his." Pansy glared at Hermione. "I didn't say I like him." "Again, why do you ask?" "Because he escaped from Azkaban last month." The rest of his friends froze. "Apparently it's a secret. After Lockhart, they don't want to let anyone know someone else escaped." There were some more sounds from the dog beside him on the bench. "I'll bet," murmured Tracy. "They'd hate to let people know that place is leaking prisoners." "Oh look, they're done." Harry used a pair of chopsticks to start serving himself food. "No." He yanked on the leash, jerking the dog back just as its jaws were about to close around a hunk of prime rib. Harry scribbled something on a piece of paper and tossed it into the air. It sailed down the hall and out the staff entrance. Professor Snape looked up from his food and spotted a gigantic black dog sitting on his house's bench. As he stared, kibble appeared in a bowl in front of the dog. "He fixed his really, Potter?" Face firmly and stalked down to have a word with his student. Harry watched Sprinkles watch the kibble with a forlorn look. "Eat." The dog shook its head. "You're not having steak. Now eat this." "A wine." "Eat or starve." "Your choice." The dog turned its gaze on Pansy, employing a passable attempt at puppy eyes for a creature the size of a pony. "Not a chance," she said. She had a slight smirk on her face. "I'm a good pure-blood girl, I know how to deny the most pitiful beggars." She rolled her eyes. Besides, I think Harry has his heart set on you having Potter." Everyone but Harry jumped. "Yes, Professor Snape?" "I'm not going to ask why there is a dog in the Great Hall. I'm not going to ask why this dog is at my house's table. I'm not even going to ask why it is sitting on a bench. I am going to ask why you had dog kibble sent up from the kitchens." "Why?" "Because if the house elves stole it from Hagrid, he's going to complain to me." "Oh." Harry paused. "I don't really care, but that's a fair reason to be upset." "Thank you. I so desperately needed your validation." "Any time, Professor." "Bad Sprinkles." Harry yanked on the leash again, just as the dog was attempting to relieve itself on Professor Snape's leg. Remus Lupin was watching Professor Snape with idle amusement until he registered the dog on the Slytherin bench. It took several moments for the thoughts to penetrate his head as he considered the fact that Sirius Black was already in Hogwarts, where the Dementors weren't allowed. He still didn't know where Harry was, although he intended to ask Professor Snape who he'd referred to as Potter. But not spotting Black's target didn't mean that he wasn't a threat. He had just risen, drawing his wand to attack when a boy with dark hair yelled "Bad Sprinkles" and pulled on Black's leash, sending the released urine shooting upwards in a graceful arc to land in the middle of Lupin's soup. He was still working on that when the boy pulled a rolled-up newspaper, a Muggle newspaper, from somewhere and smacked the dog on the nose several times. Bad Sprinkles. Bad. Watching Sirius Black, betrayer and murderer, cower as his nostrils were bludgeoned was disturbingly amusing. And since the bastard didn't seem inclined to make trouble, he could give it a bit of time. Besides, the kid seemed to be rather good with the paper. "Harry," hissed Hermione. "Yes?" Harry gave Sprinkles one last thwack on the nose and turned to look at her with his swirling, red eye. "You shouldn't hit animals." "Why?" "It's wrong." "If you say so." He whacked Sprinkles on the nose again when the dog made a lunge for some chicken. "Harry, do you really think getting worked up will help?" asked Blaze. "No." Hermione looked at her plate. "But it'd be nice if it made a difference." "It'd be nice if there were world peace," said Tracy. "What's your point?" There was a squeak as Sprinkles' head was forced into the kibble. "Eat up." There was a snort of laughter from the high table. A streak of blonde, orange, and red landed on the dog's back and wrapped around it like a humanoid limpet. "Doggy." "Huh. There's a thing." Harry went back to his doodling, using a hand to keep the dog focused on its own food. "Good evening," proclaimed Dumbledore as he stood, brushing bits of cake frosting from his beard. He gave the entire hall a brilliant twinkle and continued. "It is my pleasure to once again welcome most of you back to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Some of those who I would like to welcome back graduated, and several more who I'd hoped not to welcome back are nevertheless here. Some of you are new to our school, and so I bid you a special welcome and ask that you please refrain from asking stupid questions like where anything is. On a similar note, the Express is leaving early this year. To those of you who are new, the student body in general, and the Weasley family in particular, I direct your attention to the Forbidden Forest. I know that it is a difficult concept, but we hope that by having the word forbidden in the name, it might be clear enough to people that you are not, in fact, allowed inside. Those who enter will receive no punishment, but we will happily add their names to the discreet plaque in the entrance hall dedicated to those who did not return. In addition to that, we have a similarly forbidden thing, which is the items list. Things on this list are not permitted. Punishment varies depending on the particular item and the use to which the owner was attempting to put it. I have placed a copy of the list on the head boy's pillow. Do memorize it because I expect you to make sure your brothers are kept to the lowest tier of items on it. I am sure that all of you remember the policy about pregnancies at Hogwarts, and I will thank you to keep it in mind when you engage in indiscretions which are often conducted in areas of dubious privacy. There are a few new rules this year. For one thing, possession of a student or faculty member is now an officially recognized infraction of the rules for which punishment will be assessed most thoroughly. Possession of certain kinds of dark artifacts will likewise be treated with kid gloves under spiked gauntlets. I include for your edification the fact that being Lord Voldemort is an offense currently punishable by execution. No, I will not explain why. Finally, I would like to direct everyone to greet our newest transfer student, Ginevra Tam Riddle Weasley. She has transferred from Gryffindor to Gryffindor. Don't ask. Everyone please give her a wave, she could use some acceptance. There was a death glare being sent his way from the small redhead. With the formalities out of the way, you should head to sleep, so you can be properly late for your classes tomorrow. Students were halfway to the door when Dumbledore spoke again. I have been reminded that I should introduce this year's defense against the dark arts professor, Remus Lupin. I thank you for your applause, he said to the students, who had continued to shuffle out unlisteningly. Outtake. Good afternoon, class. Harry sat on the edge of his desk with a book in his lap. Sitting in his chair was a man in one of the ubiquitous cloaks that everyone associated with Harry seemed to wear. This one was wearing a face mask that had red and orange swirling around, and his feet were propped up. The man leapt in front of the desk. "Sit." He looked at the assembled students with his one visible eye. "My name is Toby, but you will call me sir. I've been brought in to teach some specialized techniques. Quite a large number of them have to do with pragmatic use of materials at hand." He hopped onto the desk beside Harry. "I understand that many of you have been given some basic instruction in various disciplines by my colleagues." Deidara went boom, yes? At the terrified nods, he had a posture that implied grinning. "Well, it's important that we expand on your learning." The man picked up an ice cream scoop, an air horn, some boxed spaghetti, a blue Matchbox car, a push-up bra, a can of Mountain Dew, and a fuzzy brown teddy bear. On the desk behind him, Harry placed a bound and gagged man with a damp patch at his crotch. "For example, we will begin with how to perform field surgery on a chest wound with some everyday objects." Girl Toby and her cadre had to wait for the previous class to leave the defense classroom. The boys and girls were completely soaked in gore and had expressions of shell-shocked horror. When they got inside, they found that the classroom was similarly decorated with the addition of assorted bits. Harry was somehow pristine, standing next to a man who must have been bathing in blood. "Harry?" asked Girl Toby. "Yes, Girl Toby? Is it okay if he kills people?" "Yes." "Okay." The man's one eye had turned a blood red and was fixed on Girl Toby. Dumbledore was visibly shaking. His eyes were little chips of ice. "What happened?" he snarled. The man cocked his head. "She didn't call me sir," he replied in his cheerful tone. "So I had to choke a bitch." Chapter 45, The Best Laid Lesson Plans of Werewolves and Men. Blaise had tried to go to sleep, but the dire warnings of what was to come from Hermione and Daphne had pretty much put a damper on his ability to relax. It was, therefore, with only a little shock that he found that Harry had somehow ended up sitting on the edge of his bed without appearing to enter the room. "Good morning, Blaise." "It's not morning." "Of course it is." 12:01. Blaise glared. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised." Tam wasn't. "What's that mean?" "Nothing." Blaise yelped as he was dragged from his bed and down a flight of stairs to the common room. The girl who had been Ginny Weasley was sitting there, a pebble in her hand and an expression of frustration on her face. "I'm not surprised that you were able to get into the girls' wing," she said. "Really, I'm not. But this is frustrating. It feels like I haven't practiced wandless magic in 50 years, son of a bitch." "I always thought it was like walking on water," said Harry. "Once you learn it, you never forget." Tam stared at him as Blaise was shoved into a sitting position and given a pebble of his own. "Come again?" "I think around here they talk about riding bicycles or something." Harry tossed a bone-shaped cookie to Sprinkles, whom he still had on a leash. The dog had been so busy staring at the attempts to learn wandless magic that the cookie smacked into his head, drawing a yelp. The pebble began to wobble in Tam's hand. "Not bad." Harry sat down beside the two. "I know that neither of you are the types to relax much." "Actually," began Blaise. "But it might be somewhat useful if we tried a little specialized meditation. I came across the technique over the summer while I was abroad. Waterfall had some interesting scrolls lying around next to the hero water. We start with a deep breath and focusing on our magic. It should be like a vast ocean." "I think I've heard of this," murmured Blaise as he exhaled. "But I thought it was supposed to be a stream?" "I found an ocean," replied Harry. "Isn't that normal?" Blaise looked at Tam, who seemed unmoved. "Oh. You seem very mellow," said Hermione. "It wasn't too bad." Blaise buttered some toast. "We spent a lot of time meditating. I must have a lump the size of my head though." Every time I dropped off, he hit me with a newspaper. And that made a lump? I think he put a pipe in it. That sounds like Harry, muttered Pansy. He's also the only one who can get away with this. She pointed at the huge dog who had taken the spot on the bench beside her, and was alternating between eating the kibble in its bowl and staring at her with huge, round eyes that were clearly begging for bangers. Good morning. I'm sure all of you slept well knowing that some of the most feared creatures in the magical world are just outside the boundaries of the grounds, and that they eagerly hunger for the chance to eat our souls. My Uncle Payne does that, murmured Harry. The others stared at him in horror. If, by some freak chance, you did sleep well, I expect that it will change once your professors begin giving homework. I understand that several of them, and I am thinking here of Professor Snape, have been thinking of new and devious ways to word homework such that you will have to spend more time in the library and less time, and I quote, coming up with dunderhead ways to make trouble. Those of you who are just beginning your term with us should once again be reminded that under no circumstances should you ask for help from your peers. They are under express orders to mislead you at all turns in keeping with Hogwarts tradition. Which reminds me that I should award Mr. George Weasley of Gryffindor 200 points for having the most inventive lie told last year, which resulted in the first year in question Mr. Creevy becoming so lost that we had to send out search parties. Well done. Your schedules were placed on your pillows 5 minutes ago. Classes began 20 minutes before that. I am most disappointed in my staff for lingering around over their meals instead of teaching you. Snape glanced at McGonagall and Flitwick. All three shook their heads and went back to their food. Anyone still here in 15 seconds will be docked points for cutting class. Professor Sprout covered her face as the horde rushed from the hall en masse, the screams of the slow-moving echoing horribly. Really, Albus, hissed Poppy as she drew her wand to minister to the fallen. Was that necessary? I always want to be sure that they understand the importance of maintaining schedules. Think of it this way, said Snape as he served himself some more toast and poured coffee into a special mug that had been enchanted not to dissolve. No one died this time. He took a sip, apparently unaware of the greasy plumes of black smoke that poured out of his ears. New formula? Asked Flitwick, mildly. No, said Sprout as she watched her Hufflepuffs slowly help each other to their feet and check each other over. Just new beans I grew for him. With some potions he added to their soil. It's perfect. The others went suddenly poker-faced as oily smog wafted towards the ceiling. What? Good morning, class, said Professor Lupin. Things since dinner the night before had not made him any more comfortable with reality. Apparently, the world was coming apart at the seams. He'd tried to ask after his friend's son and was mostly ignored. Snape had actually laughed outright, which was not reassuring. He'd been unable to find the boy himself, despite looking. No one resembled James Potter, and he knew the lad should look like a miniature version of his father. At least he'd been looking forwards to teaching. He'd always wanted to try it. For some reason, Snape hadn't been bitter about that either. There were muttered imprecations of no one being able to take potions off his hands, and he'd be damned if he did 2 courses at once. Then, this morning, Dumbledore had instigated a riot of sorts and seen to it that several students were badly injured without apparent concern. Lupin was beginning to suspect that his former headmaster, and current employer, was suffering from some kind of dementia or senility. The man seemed completely lucid though, he'd have to ask Madame Pomfrey. But now, there was something wrong here. He'd just greeted his class of second-year Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws, and they had all frozen in terror. He wasn't sure if he wouldn't have received a friendlier response if he'd just come out and said he was a werewolf. We're going to start our year with a practical lesson. And now one of his students had begun to cry. What was going on here? For this, we'll need to leave the classroom. Did that boy just wet himself? The class rose and followed him with an air that would have been better suited to the march of the condemned towards the guillotine. Lupin nodded politely to Professor Snape, who was reading from a potions journal in the teacher's lounge. Is this why you insisted I not get rid of the boggart? Well, yes. I was hoping to have a short lesson on them. I see. Well, I suppose it was good fortune you had a hitchhiker then. They don't seem to spend much time in Hogwarts these days. Really? Oh yeah. Yes. Anyways, don't mind me. I'm just going to read. All right. So, class, who can tell me what a boggart is? Lupin pointed to a Ravenclaw who had raised a trembling hand. Yes, miss. Higgins? It's a fear monster, Professor Lupin. It shapes itself to our fears to try and scare us away. Not bad. Anyone else? How about you, mister? Graves? They feed. I don't know, Professor Lupin. The boy flinched. Dear, dear, said Snape from behind his magazine. I thought I drilled it into you that a bunch of dunderheads need to read their textbooks. To the surprise of Professor Lupin, the boy didn't seem afraid of Snape. The last time Lupin had been able to get much information about what was going on at Hogwarts, which had been 5 years ago, admittedly, Professor Snape was the terror of the castle. Last year we were taught that reading the textbook is for pussies, Professor Snape, said a young Hufflepuff. I suspect that only applies to non-dunderheads, Miss Weeks. In the future, do the rest of us a favor and read the book until you are able to see competence with a telescope. Snape turned a page and drew a ballpoint pen, circling something and grumbling about idiots being allowed to publish. Well then, said Lupin weakly, what was going on here? Does anyone know how a witch or wizard fights a boggart? Cut off its head. Burn it alive? And dead? Sacrifice a weaker classmate? The 4DS? Despite his growing concern, Lupin had to ask. Do you mean the 3DS? No, Professor Lupin. What are the 4DS? Disembowel, dismember, decapitate, destroy. Oh. Lupin looked at Snape, who seemed unperturbed by this. No. There is a simple incantation we use. By casting it, we force the boggart to turn from something terrifying into something funny. Laughter drives away a boggart. Does it kill it? Asked Weeks. No. Then we should probably stick with the 4DS. What in the name of, no. No. The spell is ridiculous. It sounds like it, anyway, murmured Snape. Lupin was horrified to see a few students nod. No. Everyone take out your wands and try casting the spell. Lupin tried not to pay much attention to the fact that Snape was probably smirking. It was also a bit unnerving how quickly the class formed up into lines and began to practice the spell over, and even more unnerving how quickly they picked up the proper casting. See? Said Snape. Now that you dunderheads are applying yourselves. He turned another page. Speaking of dunderheads, who let this idiot near a junior chemistry set? I'm going to open the door now. Everyone has your wands ready. Lupin opened the door to the wardrobe. A figure in a red and black cloak stepped out, single red eye gleaming. Good morning, class. Every student dropped his or her wand. The pale boy gave a huge grin. Today, we have a guest instructor. A shadowy, half-formed shape in an identical cloak began to emerge, and the entire class screamed in terror, but remained frozen in place. Lupin was too shocked to act. Oh, for heaven's sake! Snape pointed his wand over the top of his magazine. Ridiculous! The figure turned into Draco Malfoy cowering in a fetal ball, while a stylized Hermione Granger menaced him with a copy of the collected works of Shakespeare. As the huddled blonde babbled for mercy, the class began to laugh with relief and the boggart fled back inside its wardrobe. Class dismissed, said Lupin, and watched the students collect their wands and shuffle out. He glared at Snape. What the hell was that about? I do believe that their last defense teacher made an impression. What? That was him. It's unusual for a boggart faced with a group to find a shared fear. Why didn't you warn me? snarled Lupin. He was sitting next to Snape at the head table, and was not happy about it, but he wanted a word with the man. Warn you about. That the boy with Siri the huge dog is also the one who taught defense last year? He named it Sprinkles. Why would he call a class Sprinkles? The dog, idiot. Oh. Lupin looked over at the dog, which was chewing desperately at its leash, while the boy holding the other end ignored it. A small smile made its way onto Lupin's face. How did you find out anyway? All right, class, what is the most dangerous magical creature you know of? Lupin asked. He decided to stop greeting his classes with good morning or good afternoon after both second-year classes and his first group of third years all flinched. HarryPotter, replied the entire class. Except for one boy who said my dad. Lupin had been prepared for a lot of answers, up to and including puffskins which weren't dangerous at all, but that wouldn't stop at least one joker from saying it. Here he was thinking of James Potter, but he had no idea whom they were talking about. What? The entire class, sans the one boy, pointed at the boy who, Lupin noticed, was still holding the leash attached to Sirius Black. Potter. Potter. Lupin shook his head. It couldn't be. The boy looked nothing like James. And that red eye, he hadn't seen Lily Potter in almost 12 years, but he was pretty sure that wasn't her eye color. Besides, do you have magical pink eye? He gasped. Yes. No, he doesn't, said an olive-skinned boy who Lupin was pretty sure was named Zabini. He just likes saying that instead of the truth which, to be fair, he hasn't told anyone. Oh. Lupin forced himself to calm down. It wasn't an outbreak of a dangerous condition, just the possibility that his memory was horribly damaged or that something had happened to the son of his best friend. We have to go to the teacher's lounge for our lesson. That seemed to evoke less anxiety than telling them it was a practical lesson. The wardrobe shook violently for a moment and then went still. Lupin glared at Snape, who had set aside his magazine to watch the display. Who can tell me what a boggart is? He listened to the frizzy-haired witch's recital of everything he'd ever heard about boggarts, and even a few guesses about their abilities to actually inflict harm that he'd never considered. Yes. Can anyone guess what's in the wardrobe? A boggart? Asked the haughty one with black hair, who had the same smooth nose he remembered on the man who went on to become Lord Greengrass. Yes. Lupin tried to teach the class the spell to fight a boggart, but kept getting distracted by the fact that the wardrobe wasn't moving. Eventually, he couldn't stand it anymore and opened the door before poking his head inside. Huh. So that's what a boggart looks like, came his voice from the depths. When he emerged, Snape had left, but the rest of the class was watching in confusion. Does anyone want to see what a boggart looks like? He was forced to give the rest of the lesson without any practical demonstration, since the boggart refused to emerge. As the students were leaving, he overheard the frizzy one speak to the boy with the red eye. I'll give you this, she said. When you taught defense, things were more active. It came up. I see. Well, I thought it would be more fun to let you find out that James Potter's son was teaching last year on your own. What? Omake. Pain? Said Sasori as he sat down at the small table that the leader of the Akatsuki used as a place to do a bit of paperwork, since his desk was still colonized by the sootfinch. I have compiled a report, and I think I can explain who is behind our recent incidents. Orochimaru. It's Orochimaru. How the hell did you know that? You did say that only 2 people knew those were your agents. Well, yes. And I took the wild leap to assume that the other person was Orochimaru. True. But we've been having other problems recently. Supplies going missing, Kakuzu's bounties being killed and claimed, that sort of thing. And all traceable to Orochimaru. Yes. But how did you know? Because the odds of multiple sources working independently to make things difficult for us just isn't that great. Granted. But it still warranted investigation. Which is why I held off on retribution towards Sound until you confirmed things. That's actually a really smart idea. I'll bet you don't know why Orochimaru is my nephew. Technically. Sasori paused. Actually, it would be fair to say that it was Hari and Toby. Pain swiped a hand down his face. How? Well, Hari kidnapped Orochimaru's protege, wrecked a chunk of the base, and made off with some valuable research. All things I'm aware of. Why Toby? Well, there was that delegation from Sound and... Oh gods. There was a witness who reported what happened to Orochimaru. You have information on that one? Pain looked down at the picture of the pale, white-haired boy with no eyebrows and an affectation of nobility. Toby. Yes, Pain? Toby was sitting on the windowsill. Do you recall that group from Sound a while back? Toby isn't sure. You leaned out the window and turned my courtyard into glass. Oh. Toby remembers them. They went boom. Toby snickered. Pain held up a picture of Kagaya Kimimaro. You missed a spot. The laughter stopped. I won't miss again. No. No. Pain rose. I'll deal with this one myself. Someone send me Itachi. It's time we take a vacation. Toby didn't know the pair of you swung that way, chirped Toby. Eep. The last part came as he found that the heavenly gaze of the omnipresent god flung him out the window without warning. Itachi entered the office. You called for me, Leader Sama? Indeed. We're going on a field trip to Sound. We're not going there to see your brother. Oh good. We will be avoiding him, in fact. Well, sort of. I think he's currently in hot water if Sasori's reports are accurate. Konoha put him on active duty already? What? He's back in Konoha. Was. What? Very briefly, in fact. I think he left after a week or so. Itachi blinked. He, God's damn it. Went back to Sound? Yes. Then why is he in hot water? If I had to guess? Because Kakuzu has a bounty he'd like to bring in. Who is there? Why is my brother helping Kakuzu collect bounties? He isn't. Ha! He's killing those bounties to annoy us. Oh. And as training, Pain added as an afterthought. Aren't Kakuzu's targets A and S rank? Yes. Oh. Indeed. And we're going to have a word with Orochimaru. About my brother. No. Pain sighed. But on our way, we will be discussing another relative of yours. They're dead. Dead, aren't they? Your son. Oh. But he's not related to me. Pain snarled wordlessly and stomped out of the room. Itachi. The Uchiha trotted out after his seething leader. Sasori was neatly collecting his papers when, from outside he heard, "Hey." What did he mean by actually? Chapter 46, The Only Thing We Have to Fear. Is children who face fear. Lupin's week didn't improve as he tried teaching successively older years. There was that paranoid part of him that suspected someone had arranged his lessons in age order just to give him a dawning sense of horror. The 4th and 5th years had been exceptionally aggressive towards the Boggart, half of them forgetting to use the charm for Boggart fighting and instead resorting to reductor curses and banishing furniture at the poor thing. He'd been having trouble convincing it to exit the wardrobe for his classes, and had begun resorting to bribes of food just to get it outside for the class. And that was after he'd switched to trying to teach the ridiculous charm before going down to the lounge in order to prevent anyone from reacting badly, a policy he adopted after the Hufflepuff and Slytherin 4th years had begun blasting when the wardrobe rattled. It didn't help that Snape was somehow making time away from potions in order to observe. If he'd overheard Dumbledore correctly, the notorious dungeon bat had actually cancelled several classes so that he could watch the interactions with the Boggart. The worst part was not being able to fault the man for finding amusement at the antics of his classes. Not because it was funny, it was actually pretty horrifying, and he suspected that only a boggart's natural resistance to harm from anything other than laughter had saved it from being destroyed, but because the man had a good reason to laugh at Lupin's pain, and the man was a former Death Eater and so probably had a certain kind of sense of humor that lent itself to a darkly physical sense of humor. Then he'd had his 6th-year class. He'd been looking forwards to the newt classes on the grounds that it meant there were only 2 left, and then he would be ready for everything that was going to happen for the rest of the year. He had begun to worry that Dumbledore, or worse, McGonagall, would comment on the fact that he had begun to drink whiskey with his dinner. After his 6th years, he stopped worrying. He also switched to fire whiskey. The class had listened to his instruction on the new spell ferociously, and then proceeded to practice with a feverish intensity. When the now familiar form of Professor Potter stepped out of the wardrobe, with a slightly terrified look on his face, the group had paused for just a second, and then there had been a clear group thought that it wasn't really Harry Potter, and the group had begun to fire the ridiculous charm in volleys. The boggart had begun to rapidly transform as a variety of shapes were forced on in rapid succession. It didn't have the time to finish being a lap-dancing Severus Snape before it was a McGonagall with clown makeup, Madame Pomfrey in a Hello Nurse outfit, Professor Sprout doing something he never wanted to see with a knot on a tree, Hagrid beating a kitten to death with a cricket bat, Gilderoy Lockhart in a gimp outfit, Professor Dumbledore, Cornelius Fudge doing a hat dance with a tricorn hat and a white wig, a toy poodle chasing a cat with odd shapes around its eyes, a robot/car thing, shouting that it was stupid and urinating on itself, a group of tiny, blue creatures with white hats who kept changing words to Borp, and similarly confusing things that began to bleed together until it managed to shamble into the wardrobe and slam the door shut again. Professor Snape had clearly been torn between abject fury at the first image and laughing uproariously at the chaos being inflicted on Lupin's class. And then 7th year. He'd made the mistake of waiting until they were in the teacher's lounge again, on the grounds that 7th years wouldn't panic. All right class, who can tell me what a bog that was as far as Lupin got before the wardrobe rattled once, and the entire class began to fling spells at it. Mostly it was bombardment curses, but a fair number had conjured iron blades and shot and banished them at the wardrobe. And some of them had even conjured silver dust and tossed it into the mess, sending Lupin's inner self into a frenzied panic that he had only just managed to keep under control. Then, suddenly, the violence had stopped and one of the girls spoke. "Sarah, you're the best at detection, move in and check for survivors. Dirkwood, Kilpatrick, cover her. The rest of you, be ready to level that spot if something goes wrong." Lupin had watched in horror as the girl cast a dozen obscure protection charms on herself, and then approached the wreckage with caution. "Dirkwood, Kilpatrick? Either of you any good at fiend fire?" Dirkwood shook his head. Kilpatrick grinned. "I had a chance to practice over the summer." "How good?" "I can get almost 15 seconds. "Right. Use that." Moments later, as the girl called Sarah cast a spell to find unlife, a piece of the ruin shifted slightly, and the whole area turned into a tiny pocket of hell. The bombardment hexes and conjurations vanished in the all-consuming flames of fiend fire as a chimera of purple-white fire devoured the space. Lupin's mouth hung open and stayed that way until he heard clapping from off to the side. His head snapped around to see Snape with a smile on his face. "Professor Potter would no doubt have been pleased with your control, Kilpatrick." 15 points on his behalf. After more than a year of Ronald Weasley on purging droughts, and his merciless training of Longbottom, he was used to giving points to Gryffindors, even if he hated doing it. "Think that ends the lesson, Lupin?" he asked. Yeah. Class dismissed. Give me 2 feet on the ways to combat fear magic." The class shuffled out, grumbling about how the target hadn't been as much work as a bound and gagged captive. "Harry?" "Hey, Hermione." Harry was sitting at the front desk in the Runes classroom, a stack of books beside him, and a blank sketchpad in his hands. "You look concerned. Why are you here?" I'm taking runes? But you're taking arithmancy. Yes. They're at the same time. Still not following your problem. So how come you WER are in arithmancy right now? Harry stared at her. When she didn't say anything, he felt compelled to offer something. Yes? He prompted. How? Trade secret. That's not an answer. It is, actually. Oh look, Professor Babbling is here. We'll discuss this later. You had better believe it. Runes and arithmancy were interesting classes that Harry felt certain he was enjoying more after the first class now that he could see both rooms at once. Even if he was forced to be present in both at the same time in order to ask questions, he wasn't having the problems he had the first day where he realized that the two classes were very much partnered and that someone had been incredibly short-sighted in setting up the entry-level classes in the same time slot. It turned out that instruction made the whole thing a lot easier too. He'd begun taking out his old ceiling texts during herbology and sitting on the lawn with a stack of semi-purloined arithmancy and runes texts from the library. He didn't technically take them out, but he did return them, and began to work on how sealing was supposed to function. After an afternoon or two though, he found that wasn't really a good option, and instead appropriated an unused room in the dungeons. And made use of shadow clones. Lots of shadow clones. This was because he had begun to experiment and had quickly discovered that doing so was unhealthy if he did so in person. Clones didn't have that concern, and so he was able to just keep trying things until they worked. Over the course of a week, he had managed to take over almost every spare room in the dungeons, which in turn meant that he could have several dozen experimental designs going at once, from the simple to the complex. Unfortunately, shadow clones weren't quite able to reason in the same way as a normal person, or he could have just had them do the studying for him, but they were still able to test things, and that was good enough. His friends were getting used to once again finding him pretty much camped out in the library at all hours, making notes in a series of apparently different notebooks that nevertheless lacked any distinguishing features. Also, everything was written in some kind of absurd shorthand that had made Tam's head hurt when she looked at it. He was spending a great deal of time with Tam these days, too, because she was fascinated by the various things he kept muttering when it came to runes and arithmancy. He had picked her brain thoroughly about her advanced and obscure knowledge, and she had been gleaning bits and pieces of what he had been doing, although she hadn't the slightest idea how or when he was doing it, since he never seemed to be out of her sight. Potter? Yes, Professor Snape? Do you recall what I asked of you over the summer? To put the potions dealer back? Yes. But I was thinking of a request I passed along from Professor Sprout. Oh yeah. Indeed. She reminded me at breakfast in no uncertain terms. So please stop spending time in the library for an afternoon and address the problem before I have to hear about it again. All right, Professor. Who can tell me the most remarkable thing about the effect of hippogriff dung on most species of plant used for potions that work on the mind? Professor Sprout was trying to get her class of first years to pay attention to the basic lessons that might prevent them from accidentally poisoning themselves later in their time in school. You there. The Ravenclaw who's picking his nose instead of listening. What? Perhaps you'd care to tell me what is so interesting? By way of answering, the boy pointed out the greenhouse wall. Professor Sprout was able to just make out a boy in a black cloak chasing what appeared to be a tree that was rustling in terror and fleeing on two legs instead of a collection of roots. The boy was waving what she was fairly certain was Hagrid's axe, and she suspected this because the half-giant in question was chasing after the boy and shouting something that sounded like Thasmiax, and then a bunch of words she hoped her students weren't able to understand, and towing a huge, black dog along with his other hand, digging furrows in the grounds. It took her a moment or two to realize that the tree was weaving its way towards Greenhouse 1, where she was currently holding her class. As it approached, she could hear it babbling. Please don't chop me down. I'll never do it again. Help Professor Sprout. Help me. And similar things. The boy seemed to be enjoying this, to judge from his smile. He also seemed to be playing with the tree, given that every now and again, he would somehow catch up for a moment, give the tree a glancing chop, and then fall behind again with theatrical displays of being winded while never being caught up by Hagrid. "What's that, Professor?" asked the boy. "That's just Professor Potter. He sometimes teaches defense. Don't mind him." "I know Professor Potter," squeaked a Slytherin. "He killed my older brother. I'm sorry about that, dear. He was stupid is what Daddy says. It's better that I'm the heir." "Oh." Sprout cleared her throat. "As I was saying earlier." She raised her voice to be heard over the greenish screams and the sounds of metal hitting wood repeatedly just outside the door. She risked a glance outside as the sounds died down and saw Harry tucking the severed limbs of the tree into his cloak and dragging away the sap-leaking torso/trunk that looked like it was sobbing pitifully by its leaf hair. She sighed and closed her eyes before returning to her teaching. And that was why she was completely unprepared for the voice behind her. "It's taken care of, Professor Sprout." When her heart had settled a little and her students had caught their breath after screaming, she turned. "Thank you," she said dryly. "I replanted it. It'll grow back. Probably. I think it will anyway. And he knows now not to start fights with other plants. I hope in general. Probably. But I told it if it annoyed you again, I'd use fire. So I think he'll listen next time." "You threatened a tree, Professor Potter?" asked one of the first years. "Well, it was able to beg for mercy, so I figured it could understand threats." The kid nodded in understanding, and mute terror at the smile on Harry's face. "Is there anything else I can do for you, Professor?" "Leave." "All right. I have a new runic array to try out." "You're testing arrays in your second wee. Where'd he go?" Omake. Itachi. Payne was strolling along with the man who was probably the sanest member of his organization, well, Madara's organization, but that was a detail. "We need to talk about your son." "All right, Leader Sama. I got a letter from him." "So, he's becoming a, you got a letter?" Payne's voice was slightly wary because Itachi was grinning a bit. "Yep. He says he had his first job." "Huh. That was quick. He mentioned something about a friend's mother passing his name along or something. Anyway, he was putting down some rebel compound in a place. The Republic of the Congo doesn't mean much to me." "You?" "Nope. Which doesn't surprise me. It's not like we know much about the place he goes to school." "Well, it took him a few hours." "Freaking bandits. Or maybe genin, right?" "Probably bandits. I don't think they have shinobi there." He wiped the place out. Good. Was he paid?" "Yeah. It was 100,000. But he says that it'll go up now that people know he can get the job done." "Okay. Now what is that in real money?" Itachi pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and skimmed it. "I remember him listing a conversion rate in here some. Oh. What's that mean?" "It means Leader Sama." "Itachi. I think it's several million Rio. At least. He's not sure because he's not up to date on gold prices here, and he had to convert it to gold to have a common exchange rate." "And it's going to go up?" "That's what he said. For hunting more dangerous foes, right?" "Oh." Itachi reread the letter. "Nope. Just because his reputation will command a better price." "Good gods." Payne blinked. I had been in the middle of saying something before. Itachi walked beside Payne in silence. "We need to talk about your son." "That's what we were just doing, Leader Sama." "Not what I meant." "Well, if you would care to explain." Itachi finished his statement with an offended sniff. Payne twitched. "Your son is, under no circumstances, allowed out of the tower without an escort." "You had already said that, Leader Sama." I want to make sure this is clear, Pain said. You see, we are now having to remind Orochimaru that he should not be fucking with us because of your son. And I'm expecting Leaf to attack any day now. That seems a little excessive, Leader-sama. Don't annoy me, Itachi, or I'll shackle him to my wrist so I know where he is. That sounds like a most prudent plan, Leader-sama. Pain looked up at the guards on the wall that had begun to move towards them. He waved a hand, exploding the gates and walking inside casually as Itachi's body was enveloped in purple-green fire that became a man in armor and possessing 4 arms. Pain's hand extended and universal attraction dragged a fleeing peon into his grip. Please inform Orochimaru that Pain and Uchiha Itachi are here to discuss matters with him. Chapter 47, An Interlude of Plot. Sorry. Potter. Yes, Professor Snape? Harry hadn't looked up from his unending quest to prevent Sprinkles eating unhealthy things. In this case, Daphne had received some chocolate from home and Sprinkles was getting whacked on the nose with a copy of the London Times each time he tried to steal a bit. I need to meet with you in the headmaster's office after dinner. Snape would be damned if this were discussed in front of the rest of the school. Does this have to do with the fact that Professor Lupin? Not in the slightest. Oh. I don't think I've done anything against the rules. I doubt that. What was that about? Pansy asked as Professor Snape made his way back to the head table. She'd been reading a letter from home, which had resulting in Sprinkles spending a bit of his time licking her hand to cheer her up. It wasn't working. I got nothing. Don't even try to tell us you haven't been breaking rules right and left, grumbled Blaze, who had been finding himself short on sleep because of Harry. All right. Well. Blaze fairly snarled. I wasn't going to even try. Hermione patted Blaze on the shoulder. Harry. I don't know why he wants to talk to me. It wasn't until that afternoon that Harry finally realized what had been bothering him about the library this year. It was telling that he'd not been in the place all last year, so he had no Sharingan memories of it. There were sections that he hadn't been able to see before. Sections labeled runes and arithmancy. He'd missed them because he'd continued his practice of not using the Byakugan in the library in case of reading something unhealthy to have in his head. Excuse me? He stopped a pretty girl with features that reminded him of home. Do you have any idea where that section came from? The runes section? Yes. You just started taking runes, right? Yeah. How'd you know? The sections are set up to prevent people from accessing them when they aren't taking the classes. Oh. Harry wished he could use his Byakugan in this room, because he'd love to see the schema that allowed that feature. Is there anything else, Professor Potter? No. Thanks. She gave him a polite smile and a quarter bow and hurried off towards a Hufflepuff. Harry walked into the section and began to grab books off the shelves. His eye whirled crazily as he read page after page. After a moment, he just grabbed a pile of books and went off to where he could safely summon shadow clones to read the books. Since he planned to review them later, that didn't matter, and he didn't want to find out the hard way that a rune scheme was active. Nice of you to join us, Mr. Potter, said Professor McGonagall drily. I had a few things I wanted to know about conjuration. Why? You seem adept enough at it already, she muttered. Well, I wanted to ask a question about Turwill's first maxim. Professor McGonagall eyed him for a moment. Then she looked at the class. Not during class. While you might be reading those books, I don't intend to derail the rest of your peers, so that I can answer what I have no doubt will be an illegal question. The room shook and a pane of glass fell out of the window. Despite the jarring movement, Professor McGonagall maintained her balance, and she was unsurprised to see Harry Potter still sitting with his feet propped up. The rest of the class was in various states of disarray on the floor, including the large, black dog she hadn't gotten around to telling him to stop dragging around, mostly because she didn't feel like having a pointless argument. What in the blasted hells was that? She growled. No idea. Harry was internally reeling slightly as he had the memory of a shadow clone that had read something distinctly unhealthy. His other clones were already cleaning the mess and checking for damage, but his head was ringing a bit. Moments later, there was a resounding crash and a blast of heat from the third floor. "I see my students practiced fiendfire over the summer," commented Harry. He watched the Transfiguration professor cover her face with her hands. "Hermione?" "Yes." The frizzy-haired girl was patting herself to check that nothing had been loosened. "Do you know what kind of magical creature looks like a monkey with a head full of water?" Kappa, I think." "Dangerous?" "No, not really." "What about when it's a paste that's been burned with hellfire?" "I highly doubt it." "Oh. Good. Do I want to know?" "Defense with the 7th years." "Oh." The pair watched as Professor McGonagall stalked out of the room. Several minutes later, she could be heard shouting, "Your lessons are outside from now on." When she returned, she was smoldering slightly, and also shaking with rage. "Fiendfire," she snarled to herself. "In the castle. Twice in as many weeks." Her glare at Harry was met with an almost beatific smile. "This is your fault. My students are diligent in their studies." She turned and went back to teaching and seemed positively delighted when Harry walked out midway through the class. "You wanted to see me, Professor Headmaster?" "Gah." Dumbledore patted his chest, while he noted that Professor Snape appeared to be adjusting to young Harry, judging from the fact that the man was an incredibly fast draw on his wand and had not even reached for it when surprised by the boy. "How did you get into my office?" "Through the secret passage. I closed it up." "Not the one I used." Dumbledore got the strange impression that the dog by Harry's feet was staring up at the lad in hateful admiration. "Just for my edification, how many of them are there?" "That you don't know about?" "I couldn't begin to guess." "How many are there in general?" "You don't want to know." "Yes, I do." "Trust me, you don't." "I think I do." "It will only make you uneasy." "I want a bloody no." "There are always 49, but they change." "I should say that there are always 49 you haven't done anything about or maybe even just aware of. 2 new ones opened up since you patched the holes you'd left before." "I'm not sure if that's an isolated incident, but I have to assume that it will be a perpetual effect, given the castle's tendency to make things complicated for you blinders." "As fascinating as this is," said Snape, "I would like to get this over with. I already know you need me to cover when Professor Lupin is busy being a werewolf." "What else is there?" "You what?" There was a yelp from the black dog. "Oh. That is what this is about. I know you don't like teaching extra classes, so I knew you'd want someone else to deal with it for you. And you already know I can do it." "To our everlasting terror," mumbled Snape. "So, I take it that you're willing?" asked Dumbledore. Indeed. I've already been working on a lesson plan to take advantage of the climate this year." Harry had stood and was dragging a desperately struggling dog towards the window. "It was so kind of you to provide them for me." He stepped out into open air and vanished as the dog stared in shock before being pulled into the ether. "Climate?" asked Snape. "I hope he doesn't mean what I think he means." "I'm sure he does. That's what I'm afraid of. I'll tell Poppy to stock up on chocolate." "That seems wise." Blaise watched in frustration as a girl a year his junior had a trio of candles orbiting her gently while she looked over Harry's shoulder at something that they were doing with a piece of paper. He had yet to get a single pebble to hover, although he was having some success at making it wobble. "You really asked McGonagall about that?" Tam was asking. "While in class?" "Well, yeah. How else would I get an answer? That whole book is illegal." "And?" "So, it's not the kind of thing she'll explain in public." "Do you know the answer?" "No." I know the book you read, but I never read the other one. It must be recent, so the question never arose. I mean, whoever diagrammed that? If you didn't do both. I did. You what? I took apart both those theorems. There's a crossover element. I'm sorry. You took them apart? Why not? It was simple enough to do. Just a basic arithmancy table from the first textbook. That must have taken forever without the more advanced methods. About 2 days. That's all? I mean 48 hours. Oh. Anyway, I found that overlap and I'd like to know if I did it wrong or not. If you didn't, you've just made a tremendous breakthrough in transfiguration knowledge. There's a thing. But what I really wanted was for you to look over this set of schema. Blaze glowered at the pebble, which had stopped wobbling as he focused on the discussion happening in front of him. Did I mention that I'm going to be teaching a few lessons this year? Blaze whimpered, even the candles orbiting Tam dipped for a moment. Yeah. It's because Professor Lupin will be busy being a werewolf. Sprinkles barked angrily and got a whack on the nose. The candles dropped to the carpet and snuffed themselves out. The pebble slammed into a wall. What? I didn't mumble. You said our professor will be busy being a werewolf. Well, he will be. You seem upset. They're dangerous. Harry blinked. Who are? Werewolves. He didn't know the 4DS. He's clearly not a threat. Dumbledore is insane, growled Tam. All I ever did was set a basilisk on the school. This is madness. Blaze coughed. You did what? Nothing, Blaze. Go back to your studies. Tam seemed to consider something. A moment later, Blaze blinked vacantly. What did I miss? Nothing, nothing. She turned to Harry. I guess I can use memory charms again. Good. Good. But seriously. Don't worry about it. We had a troll 2 years ago. What has been happening here? Things. Get those candles back in the air. Tam sighed. Fine. Harry? Hermione sat beside her friend in runes. None of their friends had taken the class, most of them preferring the more academic arithmancy to the more plebeian runic studies. Yes, Hermione. What are you doing? Working on a project. We're in class. Yes. This way I can ask questions if I need to. Harry was currently scribbling on a piece of paper. What are you writing down? The rune scheme hidden behind a faux tattoo. It's really tiny work. You've already covered 6 pages. Like I said. Harry? Yes? I've been meaning to ask. Did you get a tattoo over the summer? No. It looks like a tattoo. It's just part of a cursed seal. Harry paused. Maybe I should call it a tainted runic scheme? Someone put a tainted runic scheme on you? Yes. Who? Me. What? Anyway, I'm trying to work out exactly how it functions. You didn't know? I thought it would be an interesting project. You've been taking runes for 2 weeks and you're already doing this? Well, it seemed prudent. He raised his hand. Professor, what does this symbol mean? He waved his hand and a piece of chalk drew a complex series of runes overlapping each other. I've never seen it before. Well, I had to translate. It loses something. A bit of it looks like a container type. It looks like someone badly diagrammed a ward to hold something, but drew it wrong. Maybe. There's a lot of stuff I've never seen, but the bits I know look like warding, containing, and something that looks like a mark for souls. That's interesting. What did you mean translating? Hissed Hermione. Well, it looks the same. I can't really explain beyond that. I don't know what they do, and there are plenty of things I had to fudge to the closest similar bit, but it's still pretty good. The whole thing is almost right. It'll do for asking questions, anyway. That looks like something from the east. I guess? It's just sealing. I did a lot of research before this class. Shocking. It looks like something out of the Heian period. Oh? Yeah. That's much more interesting. I'll look into it. Omake equals. Ah, Orochimaru, purred Pain. The pale man was trussed up by several summoned creatures, and showing the early signs of severe bruising. I think we've been having a bit of difficulty in communication. You mean how you just came into my village and blew up stuff until I came to talk to you, and then wrapped me up in some sort of chameleon's tongue? Because that isn't normally what I think of as a problem in communication. No. Oh. Orochimaru cocked his head as much as he could move it. Then what are you talking about? You're what did Sasori call it? Oh yes, clandestine war against our interests for the past several months. Oh, you mean my opening negotiation for the return of my stolen research? Yes, the what? Pain closed his eyes for a moment and pinched what bit of the bridge of his nose was reachable around the piercings. The animal path made a similar gesture. Are you really telling me that you believe a concerted effort against us is part of negotiations? Of course. What else would it be? Orochimaru sounded somewhat offended. A poorly planned form of revenge against the organization because 12-year-old stole things out of the heart of your territory? That reminds me, I need to send him his fee for stress testing my defenses. Pain blinked. Run that by me again? No matter how skilled, a 12-year-old should not be able to waltz into my stronghold and make off with my apprentice and several decades' research. Pain struggled to get a grip on the conversation, which had gone very, very far from what he had been planning. It appeared that Hari's warping of normality was spreading. He needed to do something about this. Can I ask why you're here? Pain stared at Orochimaru for several long moments. No. Oh. Orochimaru considered this statement. In that case, can I go back to what I was doing? Only, I'm a bit indisposed at the moment. Pain held out a hand and slammed Orochimaru into the wall with the heavenly gaze of the omnipresent god. I'll take that as a no then? Correct. Okay. Orochimaru began to whistle a cheerful ditty. Cut that out. As you like. Leader-sama? Itachi looked in through the door, surrounded by his he who helps beyond all means. I've done a pretty thorough job of wrecking Orochimaru's stuff out here. How goes the explaining to him that if he doesn't knock it off, I'll come back and finish he job? Terribly, replied Orochimaru. He seems to have gotten sidetracked. Leader-sama, Itachi sounded disappointed. You really need to make sure you remember things like that. I gather that he was supposed to tell me to stop messing with your projects? Yep. And to stop assassinating your spies? Uh-huh. And generally cease interfering? Bingo. On that subject, I intend for your brother to continue collecting bounties as training. Kabuto informs me that it is doing wonders for him. Oh. If Kakuza needs the handicap though, tell you what, why don't you ask if he needs the handicap of no one else trying to collect his bounties? Itachi considered that. I think I'll just ask him not to murder my brother if they cross paths. Sounds like a deal. Excellent. Come along, Leader-sama. A gigantic hand gripped each of the paths and began to pull the two out of the damaged tower. Itachi? Called Orochimaru as the three were almost out of earshot. Why didn't you mention that Konan was your sister? Pain reached into he who helps beyond all means and grabbed Itachi, towing him away as the Uchiha flung bolts of heavenly illumination at the tower and screaming "I'll kill him, kill him, kill him." Chapter 48, a chapter with crack in. Or cocaine plants and fire. Lockhart's been busy, commented Blaze. He was looking at a copy of the Daily Prophet which detailed Gilderoy Lockhart's reign of terror over Western Europe. According to the Prophet, he had single-handedly robbed a pair of banks with the use of a Muggle torch limb and massacred the entire staff in each before going on to lead a gang of thugs and beating old ladies up in Paris and Amsterdam and stealing their pocket change. Daphne leaned over to read the article inside the paper. 16 old ladies with bruises and missing a dozen galleons and Muggle currency between them? She asked. He's definitely in the big leagues now, crime-wise. Did he get bored with kidnapping prisoners? She looked over at Harry for a moment and stealing gold from banks. Harry was sitting with Tam again. This time he was explaining what the book in front of them said, since it wasn't in English. She kept asking questions about it, and he had to reread passages and retranslate, admitting that it wasn't easy to convert magical theorems into English from another language. I suppose it could be seen as a good thing, Pansy offered. I mean, if he's only beating up old ladies, he's not killing more people. She considered the headlines. All right, so not killing more people. I dunno if he was really doing the stuff anyway, said Millie. I mean, he never seemed all that, well, violent here. Just kinda stupid. You never know, replied Blaze, darkly, with a glance at Harry, who had just given Sprinkles a hard yank, pulling him choking away from a plate of ribs that was being served for lunch. I mean, does Harry look violent? If you didn't know him, he added hurriedly when Daphne opened her mouth and Pansy looked uneasy. Meanwhile, Hermione and Tracy were looking over a copy of the London Times that had arrived. The lead story there was about the concerns being raised by the West and, indeed, by several countries in Central Africa, over the recent testing of what was believed to be a small-scale nuclear device by one of the Congos. There was an article speculating about the likelihood that a country described by the author as second world at best could have acquired nuclear material, and some further extemporizing on the possibility of the weapon being a so-called neutron bomb which destroyed only life, but without the fallout of conventional nukes. There was a great deal of concern about where the weapons were acquired. Both Congos, meanwhile, were claiming total ignorance, which did nothing to help convince anyone, and maintained that they had nothing to do with whatever had caused the explosion in the Republic of the Congo. Additionally, they actively accused the West in general, without naming anyone, France, of using their jungles for illegal weapons tests and trying to blame it on the locals. The UN had sent peacekeeping troops into the region to protect investigators. No one was quite clear on why armed personnel were considered peacekeepers, but the Congos were more concerned that some of the troops were from Belgium, and there was some very awkward diplomatic work to be done before those soldiers were quietly shuffled back to just about anywhere else and replaced with people who didn't have a history with the locals. Nevertheless, there was a good bit of unrest and general accusations that Europe, Belgium, was trying to go back to having imperial interests in Africa. Hermione was in no way reassured by the fact that Tracy had an amused grin on her face during their discussion. Something about it was making her glance at Harry, but she shied away from where the train of thought led, if only to protect a bit of her sanity. Instead, she focused on the fact that defense spending was being raised, which was only moderately surprising given the nature of governments and money. An owl winged its way into the great hall and landed on Harry's left, offering the letter on its leg. Harry detached the envelope, skimmed its contents, and set the parchment on fire. Rising, he walked over to the head table. Professor Headmaster, sir? Yes. I need to go on a field trip tomorrow. When will you return? 2 days, 3 at the most. It depends on how much trouble there is with getting flights. All right then. Be back by the end of the week for your first class. Thanks, Professor. Lupin stared in horror. This had to be some sort of horrible nightmare that just wouldn't end. There was no way that Albus Dumbledore had just said it was fine that a student go wandering off. And Snape seemed fine with this. Or possibly oblivious. The man apparently didn't notice the entire exchange. Snape. He hissed. Yes? Why aren't you objecting? To what? When Lupin just glared, Snape shrugged. Have you ever tried to swim up a waterfall? No. What does that have to do with anything? I have better things to do with my time than fight losing battles. Best to focus on making my students miserable and leave Potter to himself. Your dead friend would be proud at how easily he disregards things like rules. What do you mean? To date, I believe he's been given well over 700 detentions. He hasn't even been here that many days. Indeed, he has not. Far more prolific than his father. But what I was going to say was that he has yet to show up to one. He what? Wait, I tell a lie. I think he may have gone to one with Gilderoy last year. That was a few months before the unpleasantness began. How does he get away with it? As far as I recall, he just ignored any attempts to punish him. That worked? Well, on anyone else, it probably wouldn't. But Potter doesn't worry about those things as best as I can tell. I don't think Slytherin has had a point since he got here. The man sounded disturbingly cheerful about that. It was something that had been nagging at Lupin since he'd arrived, and now he could tell what it was. Slytherin was at 0 points. No one bothers taking points from him anymore, Snape went on. But I guess that we've just started leaving the points at 0 to avoid any concern that he'll do something excessive to lose them. He's going on an unspecified, unchaperoned field trip and you're concerned he'll do something excessive? Snape laughed and served himself some pudding as it appeared on the table. Merlin, this is fun. Oh yes, I'm aware that this is relatively mild. I haven't had any casualties in Slytherin this year for one thing. It helps that I didn't appoint a prefect. What? And I'm fairly certain he killed a dragon in his first year. You're making this up. Not really. It's too hard to believe. Oh, and he knows about your problem without any clear way to find out and seems unconcerned about it. What? Oh, relax. I'm not sure if anything bothers him. I'm looking forwards to you trying to forge a connection to him as your friend's son. Why is that? Because I'm sure it will be entertaining for me. But you're a sadist. Exactly. Snape gave him a sallow grin. Let's just say that his adoptive family has left him with a distinct personality that takes some getting used to. What was it you said about casualties in Slytherin? You don't want to know. Hush, Sprinkles. The dog was struggling weakly as Harry stuffed it into a large suitcase. You'll only be in there until we get off the plane. It's only about 12 hours. There was a whimper as the zipper shut, leaving only the leash extending outwards. Harry draped the invisibility cloak over the luggage and hopped over the fence, trotting around the sight lines of the security cameras and settling in the waiting area for his flight. See? Said Harry as he let Sprinkles out onto the small boat he'd stolen from the Mexican coast. That wasn't so bad. He watched absently as the dog rushed over to the side of the boat and began to pee with evident relief. Now, when we get to Columbia, you're going to need to sleep for a little while. I have some work to do. The look on Sprinkles' face, as best as a dog could manage, said that Harry could have left him behind. You'd have missed me, Harry replied, ignoring the growl of displeasure. Harry dragged the unconscious dog through the fields of Columbia until he found the right cocaine fields. It hadn't been particularly easy, given the lack of clear directions from his employer. He found himself wishing he'd learned Spanish, because it would have been nice to be able to ask the natives, but instead he was forced to rely on wandering around, hoping that he'd find someone who spoke English. Or Japanese. Or Mandarin. Or Cantonese. Or Korean. Or Vietnamese. Or, in fact, almost any language commonly spoken around the China Sea, although his grasp of languages coming out of the subcontinent was rather poor. It took him the better part of a day and a half to find the field belonging to the warlord he was supposed to find. Technically, the contract only specified that he was supposed to kill the man in charge, but someone had thoughtfully added a clause with bonuses for each subordinate removed and hectare of cocaine field burned. It was a shame, really, because it meant he had to first go kill everyone so he could have an accurate count. Oh well. Harry looked down at the dog beside him. Its head lolled to the side from the blow he'd used. He hit it again to make sure it stayed out, then summoned 100 shadow clones. Each drew a tanto from its shoulder and ghosted into the warlord's territory. "Excuse me, sir." The warlord turned around. Standing in front of him was a scrawny white kid with a dog on a leash. His scarred face twisted into a facsimile of a smile as he considered the options for profit with the boy. "Are you the one in charge?" "See." The warlord's hand lashed out, smacking the boy for talking. It took him a moment to recognize the lack of sensation from his arm, and to notice, in fact, the lack of arm in general. "Oh good. I wanted to be sure I didn't need to go looking." The boy shoved a blade into the warlord's stomach and slashed it open before severing his head and shoving it into a bag. Outside the man's office, a pile of heads was being formed by his clones, who were diligently executing their captives, who were bound in a line, waiting their turn. As he listened to the peaceful sound of nothing at all, the prisoners were gagged. He went through the field stripping them of their plants in case he could find a use for them later. He made a mental note to talk to Professor Snape about it when he checked in on the Hero Water project. It took a few hours to finish the slaughtering and seal up the heads for transport. The clones spread out to the edges of the warlord's territory, and Harry watched with interest as they systematically used intelligent hard work and pressure damage to turn the entire area into a wasteland. Harry whistled to himself as he strolled back towards the coast. He'd nearly reached his boat when he remembered that he had another stop to make. The warlord was roused from his sleep by screams outside. Those were normal, but not at this hour. He had forbidden torture or execution during his nap time to avoid disturbing him if someone were especially inventive. As such, he went to the window with an assault rifle to shoot someone for waking him, and saw a gigantic mound of heads in the open space between buildings in his compound. On a stake in front of it was his rival's head. He stared in a mix of joy and horror. Then he called his lieutenants to him and ordered that the dawn be paid immediately. Harry walked through London with his dog and stopped in at his usual residence during the summer. A short conversation with the owners revealed that someone had sent word from the Bank of London that a massive wire transfer from the Cayman Islands had arrived, and would he like them to invest it, please? Harry decided to consider trying out insider trading over the summer, or maybe during the winter break. He also stopped off at the Davises' house and gave Claire a bouquet of vintage World War II rifles in thanks for directing business his way, and to let her know that there was a second satisfied customer. "Good morning," Harry said as he sat down beside Tam. "It is indeed," she replied. "I got sleep last night." She hurriedly held up her hands. "I meditated the night before. And during several classes." "Good, good." Harry nodded to Blaze, who looked similarly rested. "How was defense?" "Interesting. Professor Lupin seems to be accelerating our curriculum to address the shrinking supply of examples." "Your previous students reacted badly to the hinkapunk," explained Daphne. "The fourth years butchered it, so he had to scramble to sort out lessons for the rest of the week." "It's been interesting," added Pansy. "Certainly less involved than your classes. But on the other hand, he always seems to be unprepared. Probably because of that accelerated lesson plan." "Doggy." A blur with a red and gold tie slammed into Sprinkles and snuggled him ferociously. "I'm a bit disappointed," said Hermione, ignoring the antics of the masked girl. "I had really thought we'd learn more this year. While your classes weren't covering what you were supposed to, I admit that we at least had to think." "Thank you, Hermione." "I'd have had the hinkapunk myself, but he pulled it away before I could finish the job," grumbled Millie. "You weren't even using magic," murmured Tracy. "I think you were supposed to. Not just beat it with your fists." "It was working." "True," conceded the redhead, "but not the point of the class." "Details." "Things have been lively then?" asked Harry. "Not really. Chapter 49, Roar. Or Spoon has vandalized my writing again. Harry? Said Tracy when Harry sat down with Sprinkles. She shoved a copy of the London Times at him. Know anything about this? Harry glanced down at the paper. The headline screamed Colombians have the bomb? And detailed the suspected link between the Republic of the Congo and one or more warlords in Colombia. Apparently, a notorious drug lord had been killed, along with the total annihilation of his entire territory. The Colombian government had been searching and reported that, so far, they had found no survivors of the explosion. The only good news was that the Geiger counters were coming up quiet, so there wasn't a giant cloud of radiation getting ready to be blowing into the greater Americas. The UN had begun to rapidly deploy more inspectors into a region well known for being unsafe to those who visited for government business. As a result, in addition to their normal peacekeeping force of heavily armed soldiers, they included the Belgians who were cooling their heels in Brussels while waiting for their turn to come up again on the duty roster. It was presumed that firstly, the Belgians had no particular antipathy to the Colombians, since their empire had never extended beyond a single, large, holding, and secondly, that if they ended up disrupting the drug lords in the region as part of some sort of imperial ambition, that this was probably not such a bad thing, and so what was the downside? Initial reports were that there had been a larger explosion than had taken place in the Congo more than a month prior. The upside to this one was that it appeared to have killed a particularly unpleasant person, and that was to the good. But there was a great deal of concern that whomever had been testing some sort of weapon in Africa was able to smuggle a larger version to the Americas. Or that the weapons program was based in Colombia. Either way, the permanent member nations of the Security Council had already issued stern press releases decrying the use of such devastating weapons without clearance from them. France was also loudly pointing out that they wouldn't test in Colombia, as it was clearly not a nice enough place to deploy nuclear weapons. The fact that these weapons were not nuclear was taken as a counter to that claim and, therefore, it was still possible that France was behind it. That was the position taken by the Times, but as a British paper, that was expected, and it was presumed that they would have asserted that even if someone other than a Frenchman had actually been seen using the weapon in question. What about it? Asked Harry. Do you know anything about this? Tracy, I'm not exactly up to date on the secret weapons experiments of major nations at the moment, let alone smaller ones doing it in even greater secrecy. Give me a few more months and I might have tightened up my ability to know that kind of thing. That's not what I meant. Oh. I'm not sure how else I might know about it. I mean, the world government seems pretty sure that this is an illegal weapons program. Do they? Oh yes. Says so in the story on A4. Harry. How about that? Harry cocked his head. Against the urging of Daphne, who hissed for Tracy to shut up and Pansy's sudden look of terror, Tracy demanded to know what Harry was talking about. Harry held up a finger and then rose, dragging Sprinkles away from his kibble and across the hall to the Ravenclaw table, where he proceeded to pull a newspaper out of a girl's hands and walk away while she blinked in uncomprehending blankness. Here. Harry held out the only copy of the Quibbler in the school. Hermione? Tam had looked up from her book, the cover of which was itself covered with construction paper. I've been meaning to ask, she was observing Hermione, who was delicately removing pieces of sausage from a link on her fork and shredding them with her pointed teeth. Your teeth. Harry's fault. Tam glanced over at Harry, who was watching Blaze and Tracy read the Quibbler, both of them with looks of trepidation. Really? Tam looked back at Hermione. Because that looks rather like a ritual to me. Harry's fault. That's odd. I'm pretty sure there's a warning about it. Harry's fault. I tried to warn her, said Harry. I told her she could read one page of the ritual book, and she chose to read the page on the ritual to make teeth even. But isn't the warning on the next page? Yep. Harry's fault. You know the worst part? Asked Tam as she squinted a bit. I don't think they're even. What? Hermione hastily conjured a mirror. I see you're already doing advanced wandless conjuration. Hermione scowled. They're even. Are they? Asked Tam innocently. I guess my eyesight might not be so good. Good. Maybe I should use a ritual to improve it. Oh wait, there's a warning. Tam blinked at the small block of marble she'd instinctively created to block the thrown plate of food. That's working better, I guess. This can't be real. Tracy was rereading the article for the third time. It's the Quibbler, said Blaze. Of course, it's not real. It sure looks pretty real though, doesn't it? Said Harry. Lots of details that people not on the ground wouldn't have. I especially like the diagram of the encampment. It's not like the inspectors are going to be able to draw one of those accurately now. So? It could be made up, Blaze retorted. Nah. It's pretty much spot on for the layout. How do you know that? I still don't believe it, Tracy said. There's no way Lockhart was heroic. She glared at the paper, the headline of which screamed Lockhart saves kidnap victim from drug lord. The text went on to describe a high-ranking United States official in the State Department whose daughter had been kidnapped by a Colombian drug cartel in order to pressure him into making recommendations to his superiors that would be beneficial to their enterprise. What those recommendations were was not specified, but it was hard to think of what kinds of suggestions would possibly be helpful when the entire organization was devoted to criminal activity. Apparently, the man had realized that the cartel was almost certainly watching him, and had opted to not alert his employers. Instead, he had flown to California and wandered around Los Angeles for a week before finding himself in a laundromat run by someone with a very bad Chinese accent. Details after that were a bit sketchy for a few days while the team found a plane. Once they had landed in Colombia, they had proceeded directly to the cartel's territory and proceeded to beat up most of the goons there before getting captured by a very obvious trap. Lieutenant Colonel Lee Sunsin had devised a plan for their escape that involved chewing gum, sawdust, 3 pairs of pliers, a large spring, and a decommissioned tank. A second unit of identical personnel helped make the necessary modifications. The tank had done tremendous damage to the camp and scared the heck out of the evil drug cartel before driving off to the airstrip. The team had escaped without casualties on either side and with the kidnapped victim into the bargain. They had been about to go back to rally the workers when Lieutenant Pretty Boy had spotted something on the water off the coast and had said, "Oh shit, not him," and insisted that they take off immediately. Details were once again unclear until the miraculous return of the kidnapped daughter to her overjoyed father, followed by a frantic escape in a custom panel van, chased by several branches of the military police down a crowded Boston street in the middle of rush hour, doing untold damage to various vehicles and properties when the military police crashed into just about everything in the area other than their quarry. That's odd, said Pansy as she skimmed the copy of the Prophet she was reading. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel for Lockhart, aren't they? The Prophet declared that Lockhart was guilty of kidnapping a mental patient from the Muggle institution in which he was being kept because he kept claiming to see magic, among other things, which included digging escape tunnels under the sanitarium, setting loose all the therapy animals, and supposedly being a member of a gang of escaped criminals guilty of everything from robbery to evading arrest to making the authorities look stupid. According to the paper, he had entered the hospital wearing a white robe, which was a Muggle thing that indicated that the person in question was a medical professional, and informed the duty nurse that the man was needed to donate a lung to his former commanding officer. The nurse had pointed out both that the officer in question was currently on the lam and, in fact, wanted for a long list of crimes, and that the patient in question had donated lungs on at least 2 prior occasions. Lockhart had somehow talked her into reconsidering after he had locked her alone with him in a broom closet for an extended period during which her screams of terror were barely muffled, and the traumas of which she refused to discuss. Lockhart had also stolen a Gulfstream jet from a runway, while the owner waved them away with well-wishing and hoped that their trip to save the dying patient from his tubular microencephalotoscolia polioiditis. He had wheeled an unconscious man onto the runway and somehow talked the man who owned the plane, and who had been about to take off, to let them use it to fly to London for specialized treatment before promptly taking off on a direct route to Colombia. The strangest thing had been the sheer amount of metal on the patient. The man whose plane was used reported seeing the aircraft have trouble getting into the air because of the weight. He was further guilty of possession of Muggle weaponry and the use thereof while in a foreign country for the purpose of terrorizing an important figure in local governance. The Prophet was not clear on exactly what the victim did in Colombian government, but they felt sure that it must be important if arch-criminal Gilderoy Lockhart was trying to cause chaos. It was also noted that Lockhart kidnapped a young woman who was a guest of the man, forcibly abducting her from his manor and forcing her into a Muggle aeroplane, an obvious form of coercion, to be taken to the colonies, another black mark on his already dark list. The fact that he did this to a Muggle woman was considered something of a mitigating circumstance, but only just the implication was that someone not already blatantly evil might have been considered to be acting rightly in his dealing with a Muggle female, but not Lockhart, devil that he was. There was a separate article detailing the fear that the Muggles were developing some new anti-magic weapons. Given the magical world's insular nature, the normally vague and unsubstantiated reporting of the paper was reduced to idle speculation with even less basis than usual, although there was an opinion piece calling for a culling of Muggles in order to prevent them from spreading or developing anything beyond those vile rifles. "Good evening, Professor." Snape didn't even look up from his cauldron. "Hello, Potter. What do you want?" "Well, I was thinking of checking on how your study of hero water goes." Snape sighed and lowered the heat to simmer the potion he was making. Slowly. "I have a full set of classes to teach classes. I will not allow you to take over for me, by the way, so I need to work on it during my spare time when I don't have to brew potions for the school. For some reason, Poppy has me making blood-replenishing potions by the cauldron full, and even preparing the treatments used for regenerating limbs and organs. I can't think why she might feel those are priority potions with you teaching this year. Have you made any progress?" "Hard to say. Does it count if I've found a lot of things that don't tell me anything useful?" "Not really. This is why you're not a potions master." "I'm working on it. Anyway, the real reason I came by was because I wanted to ask whether raw cocaine has use in potions." Snape froze. "Yes," he said carefully. "There are at least a dozen I can think of offhand." "Cool. Not a single one of them is legal," Snape continued. "The possession of cocaine in any form is a serious crime, and a potions master with it would be in even more trouble." "Fascinating," Harry replied. He unsealed a large trunk and put it on the floor beside Snape's desk. "Let me know if you find any legal uses for it." He gave the professor a jaunty wave and left the room. Snape stared at the trunk in horror for several moments. Then he walked over to a wall and pressed one of the stones in it. The wall slid open, revealing a seemingly endless pantry with dungeonly appropriate lighting. Snape levitated the trunk onto a shelf and let the door shut on the pantry of ingredients we don't have honest. Outtake. Harry cocked his head to one side when he felt the beginnings of a tug on his body. That was odd. As it grew stronger, he absently created and substituted with a shadow clone which began to tug sprinkles away. The sensation was similar to when he left home for school. He hoped he wouldn't be away too long. "You're sure this ritual is going to work?" asked Severus Snape, looking at the empty patch of carpet in the headmaster's office. "Of course, Severus." Dumbledore twinkled cheerfully at the man. He frowned a little. "It's merely taking a little more time than we had expected. It's been 4 hours. A lot more time, then. And it's our only hope if we need to keep Voldemort at bay until young Harry is ready to die. You're sure we can't have that happen soon?" Snape sounded almost like he was whining. Yes. It's imperative to the whole operation that he take at least 4 more years. With Black on the loose, we can't be sure he will survive that long. He will need to do many difficult things and experience much trouble. Have you heard back from Karkaroff about the tournament for next year? I got a letter from him yesterday. He says he's fine with it as long as his students will be at risk to toughen the pussies up. So, we'll tell them that dragons are acceptable then. Remind me to have them make the chains long. Of course. So, where's our hero? It seems that he or she is taking his or her sweet time. Hello. Harry looked around. Good evening, other Professor Headmaster, other Professor Snape. What brings me to your office? That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.